Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're settling into a quieter kind of history. Not battles, not kings, not the collapse of empires, but something far stranger and in its own way, far more relentless. Tonight we're talking about the quiet, smiling war that processed food companies waged against the American housewife in the 1950s. No soldiers, no weapons, just soup cans, cake mixes, and advertisements that could make a woman feel guilty for boiling water the wrong way. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of slow, strange, half-forgotten corner of history, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a tap of your thumb. And if you're the type who likes to leave a comment before drifting off, let us know where you're listening from tonight, and whether your own family ever had a specialty dish made almost entirely out of a can. Now dim the lights. Let the room go quiet. Maybe put on a fan, or let the rain outside do its work, and get yourself comfortable, because we're about to spend the next few hours in a decade that insisted, loudly and constantly, that happiness could be purchased in powdered form. Have you ever stopped to wonder what it actually felt like to be told, every single day, by every magazine on the coffee table and every voice on the radio, that a good wife was measured in minutes saved and cans opened? That convenience wasn't a gift, but a test. That if dinner took longer than the advertisement promised, something about you personally had failed. Did housewives in 1954 actually believe the cheerful voices selling them instant potatoes and canned gravy? Or did they quietly roll their eyes while spooning gray-pink ham salad onto good china? Was the grocery store really the temple of modern living the commercials claimed? Or was it just a very bright room full of quiet, low-grade guilt? And why exactly did an entire generation of cookbooks decide that virtually nothing was complete without a layer of crushed cornflakes on top? Let's find out together. Close your eyes if you like. You don't need to remember any of this. You only need to listen. Congratulations, you have just opened your eyes in the autumn of 1953. Somewhere outside, a lawn mower is humming. Somewhere inside, an apron you don't remember putting on is already tied neatly around your waist, and a percolator is clicking softly on the stove as though it has been waiting for you personally to arrive in this timeline. The kitchen around you is almost aggressively cheerful. The walls are the color of a robin's egg. The cabinets are the color of vanilla ice cream. The trim along the ceiling is a yellow so bright it seems to hum faintly on its own frequency. Nothing in this room looks like it has ever been used, and yet everything in it insists that it is here purely to be used by you, endlessly, cheerfully, forever. You notice the refrigerator first. It's new, you can tell by the way it gleams, by the faint chemical smell of fresh enamel, by the way it seems to sit in the corner of the kitchen like an expensive guest who expects to be thanked. It hums at a pitch just high enough to notice and just low enough to ignore, the exact frequency, you suspect, of quiet financial obligation. Your feet are bare against the linoleum, and the linoleum is so polished it could double as a mirror in an emergency. You look down and you can almost see your own reflection looking back up at you, faintly unimpressed. You try to remember in some vague and disconnected way when kitchens started looking like this, less like rooms where people cooked, and more like showrooms where a certain kind of life was supposed to be performed. There's already something on the stove. Of course there is. A pot of something beige is simmering with the low, patient confidence of a dish that has done this 1,000 times before and expects no resistance from you. You lift the lid and peer inside. It appears to be chicken, suspended in a sauce built from at least 2 different cans, dotted with peas that have clearly never seen a garden. It smells, somehow, exactly like every other kitchen in every other house on this street is probably smelling at this exact moment. Comforting, familiar, a little bit like defeat. On the counter, 3 magazines are fanned out like a hand of cards someone dealt you without asking. Their names are almost interchangeable: Modern Homemaking, The Better Wife, Kitchen and Character, and their covers all feature the same woman in 3 different outfits, each one beaming with a kind of joy that looks like it was achieved through considerable personal sacrifice. She's holding, depending on the cover, a casserole dish, a feather duster, or a small child who appears to have been recently bribed into good behavior. You pick one up and flip it open, and the first thing your eyes land on is a bold headline promising to teach you how to turn an ordinary Tuesday into a small triumph of modern living. You close the magazine again, gently, the way you might close a door on a conversation you don't want to have yet. The kitchen itself has the eerie stillness of a stage set 5 minutes before the actors arrive. No crumbs on the counter, no dish left in the sink. No smudge on the window, no forgotten mug, no single sign that any actual human being lives here and occasionally makes a mess. It's less a kitchen than a kind of test, an empty exam waiting for you to fill it in correctly. You reach for the coffee pot, hopping for something dark and strong enough to make the day feel survivable. Instead, your hand closes around a squat glass jar labeled in bright red letters, "Instant," ready in seconds. You unscrew the lid and are greeted with a fine brown powder that smells vaguely of coffee, the way a photograph of a beach smells vaguely of the ocean. You spoon some into a cup, add hot water and stir, watching it dissolve into a liquid that is, in the most technical sense, coffee-colored. As the caffeine begins its slow crawl through your bloodstream, you become aware of just how staged this whole morning feels. Every surface too clean, every color too cheerful. It's less a house than a diagram of a house, an illustration from a manual of what a life is supposed to look like, with none of the mess that makes an actual life recognizable. You search the room for some small piece of evidence that a real family lives here. A crayon mark on the wall, a single unmatched sock. Nothing. The sink is so empty it looks almost offended, as though dishes are a concept it has heard about but never personally experienced. And then you notice the apron. Not the one already tied around your waist. A second one, hanging from a hook by the pantry, ruffled at the hem, patterned with cherries, radiating the unmistakable energy of a costume rather than a garment. You realize, somewhere in the back of your mind, that the one you're already wearing was simply assumed. Nobody asked. The day itself assumed it for you, the way it will assume so many other things about you before this is over. You tie the second apron over the first anyway, because some part of you understands instinctively that this is simply how the day begins. Not with a choice, but with a costume already laid out, a role already cast, and a kitchen that exhales almost audibly the moment you accept it. Breakfast, you realize, is next. And breakfast in 1953 comes with its own particular brand of quiet propaganda. You open the cupboard and find a wall of boxes, each one shouting some version of the same promise, energy, vitality, a full and satisfied family, all delivered via a small waxed paper bag of toasted wheat or corn. The mascots on the front are almost unnervingly enthusiastic. A cartoon rooster crows about vitamins. A grinning sun-shaped character insists that a fortified breakfast is the secret to a happy household. You pick one at random and pour a bowl, watching the flakes settle with the quiet rustle of something that has been dried and boxed and shipped a very long way to end up in front of you at 7 in the morning. The milk is cold enough to fog the outside of the bottle. You pour it over the cereal and watch the flakes begin their slow surrender, crisp for exactly as long as it takes you to lift the spoon, and soft by the time it reaches your mouth. It's the culinary equivalent of a promise that expires the moment you rely on it. Somewhere down the hall, the radio has switched itself on, or perhaps it was already on and you're only now noticing it, and a cheerful announcer is explaining, with the total confidence of a man who has never personally prepared a meal, that a well-fortified family starts the day right. You glance at your bowl, at its handful of dry, air-light flakes, and wonder exactly how right a day can start on something this insubstantial. Your husband wanders in a few minutes later, pours himself a bowl without glancing at a single word of the box, and eats it standing at the counter while reading the newspaper. He has never once, you suspect, thought about vitamin fortification, portion balance, or whether the household's nutritional needs are being properly managed. That particular burden, you understand without being told, belongs entirely to you. By the time you rinse your bowl, The sugar has already made its brief, dazzling promise and is already beginning to fade, leaving behind the particular hollow feeling of having eaten something that was mostly air and marketing. It's not even 8 o'clock, and you've already been sold to twice, once by the cereal, and once by the fictional version of yourself the box assumed you'd become the moment you poured it. The refrigerator is next, and opening it feels a little like opening a door into a very small, very cold museum exhibit titled Evidence of Insufficient Planning. Cold air rolls out in a slow wave, brushing against your ankles, carrying with it the mingled scent of last night's dinner, a jar of pickles old enough to have opinions, and something wrapped in wax paper that you suspect used to be ham. Everything inside is arranged with the obsessive tidiness of a person who read an article about refrigerator organization and took it far too seriously. Bottles lined up by height, jars grouped by color, a carton of eggs angled so precisely it looks like it's posing for a photograph. You stand there for a moment, illuminated by the pale interior light, feeling faintly interrogated. The milk bottle seems to whisper that you're running low. The butter dish seems to sigh that you should have planned better. Somewhere behind a jar of mustard, a head of lettuce sits wilting quietly, ashamed of itself, as though it too has read the same magazines you have and understands exactly what's expected of it. This is the strange emotional trick of the 1950s refrigerator. It isn't simply a box that keeps food cold. It's a small glowing monument to your own competence, or lack of it. The advertisements never said this directly, of course. They showed women standing proudly in front of refrigerators the size of small closets, shelves stocked with an abundance that looked less like groceries and more like a harvest festival, their smiles suggesting that owning this machine had somehow deepened their marriage, improved their children's manners, and possibly extended their own lifespan by several years. Your refrigerator, by comparison, holds a half-used jar of mayonnaise, 3 eggs, a lonely stick of butter, and the remains of whatever the beige pot on the stove used to be before it became today's problem. You close the door a little too firmly, and the bottles inside rattle in what feels suspiciously like protest. The freezer compartment is its own separate kingdom, and you open it out of obligation more than curiosity. Frost has crept over every surface in a thick, pale crust, thick enough that you can no longer identify what, exactly, is frozen beneath it. Somewhere under that ice sits a bag of peas, and possibly a second, older bag of peas that predates the first one, fossilized in permafrost like a tiny green woolly mammoth. You chip at the ice half-heartedly with a butter knife, achieve nothing, and close the door again, making a private, silent promise to deal with it later that you both know you won't keep. The magazines, of course, have opinions about defrosting too. An article on the counter insists that a well-organized freezer is a badge of household discipline, which feels like an unreasonably large amount of moral weight to place on frozen peas. You decide quietly that the freezer can remain undisciplined for one more day. You pull out what's left of last night's casserole dish and set it on the counter to examine your options. It sits there, cold and slightly congealed, a beige rectangle of yesterday's effort. According to every cookbook currently open somewhere in this house, leftovers are not simply food to be reheated. They are a moral obligation. Waste is treated less like an inconvenience and more like a quiet betrayal of the entire nation's post-war economic recovery. You are, apparently, meant to feel a small patriotic thrill every time you manage to stretch 3 eggs and half a can of soup into something resembling a second dinner. You close the refrigerator door gently, the way you might close the door on a room you're not ready to clean yet, and you turn your attention to the day's real task, assembling something that will, by dinner time, be called a casserole. Casserole construction, you're discovering, follows a kind of unspoken architecture. There is always a base, usually some form of protein, though the word protein is doing a great deal of work here, since the chicken in question spent most of its existence inside a can and has only a distant, theoretical relationship to an actual chicken. There is always a binder, a can of condensed soup. which slides out of its tin in one long, unbroken cylinder, retaining the shape of the can with a kind of stubborn dignity, as though it resents being asked to become dinner. And there is always, a topping, something crushed and crunchy sprinkled across the top like a crown, because a 1950s casserole without a crisp topping is considered, by the cookbooks at least, barely a casserole at all. You reach for the crushed cornflakes, because today, like most days, the cookbook insists that breakfast cereal makes an excellent savory garnish. You crush a handful between your palms and sprinkle them across the top of the dish, wondering, not for the first time, at what exact moment in culinary history someone decided that a chicken and pea casserole needed the same topping as a cereal bowl. The recipe calls this efficient, streamlined, a triumph of modern convenience cooking. You call it, privately, a kind of edible improvisation, the culinary equivalent of using whatever's in your pockets to fix a flat tire. Because that, in the end, is what a casserole really is. Not an invention, but a disguise. A way of taking whatever happens to be in the pantry, the last of the chicken, the extra peas, the half can of soup nobody wanted to throw away, and binding it all together under a golden, crunchy lid so that no one at the table asks too many questions. You slide the dish into the oven, and the kitchen begins to fill with that particular warm, beige smell that will follow this decade through the rest of history. Comforting in the way a familiar sound is comforting, whether or not the sound itself is actually pleasant. While it bakes, you flip through the cookbook one more time, and your eye catches on a full-page photograph advertising the very soup you just used, showing a smiling mother presenting the finished casserole to her family like a small ceremonial offering. The caption underneath reads something about a happy home being built one dish at a time. You glance at your own dish, bubbling faintly behind the oven glass, and privately conclude that no home has ever been built, happy or otherwise, out of canned mushroom soup. Fed, certainly. Built, that seems like a stretch. There is, tucked into the same cookbook, an entire chapter devoted to a category of food that deserves its own careful examination, the gelatin salad. You didn't ask for this chapter. Nobody, you suspect, ever really asked for this chapter. And yet here it is, dozens of pages deep, glossy photographs of translucent, wobbling domes suspended with all manner of ingredients that have no business being suspended in anything, let alone lime-flavored gelatin. The color alone deserves comment. It isn't a shade of green that occurs naturally anywhere on Earth. It glows faintly, even in a still photograph, the exact hue of something a chemistry set might produce by accident. You stare at a recipe titled Molded Chicken Supreme, which asks you to suspend shredded chicken, diced celery, and canned pineapple inside a lime gelatin base, and you find yourself wondering what committee, exactly, approved this as supreme. The instructions are written with total, unblinking confidence, as though the author has never once paused to consider that suspending meat inside a fruit-flavored dessert might raise questions. Fold gently, the recipe says, to keep the chicken fibers intact. You read this sentence twice, because something about the phrase chicken fibers, suspended gently inside a glowing green dome, feels less like a recipe and more like a warning label, you decide, for reasons you can't entirely explain, to make one anyway. Perhaps it's curiosity. Perhaps it's simply what the day expects of you. You dissolve the gelatin powder in hot water, and the kitchen briefly fills with a smell that is somehow both citrus and faintly chemical. The exact scent, you imagine, of 1950s optimism condensed into a single packet. You pour the liquid into a mold shaped, inevitably, like a wreath, because in this particular decade nearly all food seems obligated to resemble either a holiday decoration or a geological formation. Into the cooling liquid you add the chicken, the celery, and the mandatory pineapple, because pineapple in the 1950s appears to be a legally required ingredient in roughly 40% of all recorded recipes. The mold goes into the refrigerator to set, and you find yourself, hours later, tipping it out onto a serving plate with a soft, unsettling sound, something between a sigh and a small structural collapse. It stands there on the plate, glistening, faintly threatening. A solid green monument to a decade that seemed to believe almost anything could be improved by suspending it in Jell-O. You garnish it with a sprig of parsley. Because the cookbook insists, though the parsley does absolutely nothing to disguise the fact that there is, somewhere inside that glowing green dome, a significant quantity of chicken. When your family finally gathers around it at dinner, there's a long pause before anyone reaches for the knife. The particular silence of people quietly working up the courage to try something none of them fully trust. By mid-morning, the list on the counter has grown to nearly 3 full pages, which means it's time for the grocery store, a place the advertisements describe as a temple of modern convenience, and which you're beginning to suspect is really just a very brightly lit building designed to make you feel a specific, low-grade guilt in every single aisle. The fluorescent lights overhead buzz with a cheerfulness that borders on aggressive. Your cart pulls faintly to one side, the way shopping carts across this entire decade seem contractually obligated to do, as though the wheel itself has philosophical objections to the frozen food aisle. The first thing that greets you, just past the entrance, is a towering pyramid display of gelatin boxes, lime, strawberry, and something described only as festive, stacked with the precision of a small architectural monument. A cardboard cutout beside it depicts a woman holding a bowl of the finished product, her smile so wide and so fixed that you find yourself wondering, quietly, what exactly she had to go through to achieve it. You move deeper into the store, past the produce section, which in 1953 seems to exist mostly as a kind of decorative afterthought. The vegetables sit under harsh lighting, slightly wilted as though they, too, understand they are not really the star of this particular show. You select a head of lettuce out of a sense of obligation rather than any real enthusiasm, because appearances, as every magazine has reminded you at least twice this morning, do matter. The true heart of the store lies further in, aisle after aisle of cans, boxes, and jars, each one promising some small miracle of convenience. Soups condensed into thick, clinging paste. Noodles that boast of cooking in a mere 12 minutes. As though minutes were the primary unit by which a homemaker's worth is measured. Canned pineapple appearing again and again on shelf after shelf, with the quiet persistence of a decade-wide inside joke nobody quite has the energy to explain to you. You pause at the soup shelf for a long moment, staring at the neat rows of identical red and white cans. Cream of mushroom, cream of chicken, cream of celery. An entire taxonomy of condensed creams, seemingly designed for the singular purpose of holding casseroles together by force. The label promises rich, wholesome nourishment. You suspect, deep down, that the actual ingredients would prefer not to be examined too closely, and you place 6 cans into your cart anyway, because experience, yours and apparently every other housewife's on this street, has taught you that 6 is never quite enough. Further along, the frozen food case glows with a strange, futuristic light, displaying trays of something called a TV dinner. A single foil tray divided into neat little compartments, each one holding a different component of a full meal, ready, according to the box, in under 30 minutes with almost no effort at all. You linger there longer than you mean to, imagining, just for a moment, a version of dinner that doesn't require your full and constant attention. Then you remember that skipping dinner preparation entirely tends to invite questions you'd rather not answer tonight, and you move on. At the checkout, your cart is heavy, not just with food, you realize, but with a whole week's worth of expectation. The cashier rings everything through with the practiced, slightly weary efficiency of someone who has seen a great many carts exactly like this one. You step back out into the afternoon sunlight, bags in hand, feeling, in some indefinable way, both fully provisioned and already a little bit tired. Back home, bags unpacked, the kitchen counter has become a kind of makeshift altar to the printed word, 3 magazines, a mail-order catalog, and a folded newspaper insert, all promising, in one way or another, to teach you how to live correctly. You sit for a moment before the next round of chores begins, and you let yourself actually read one, instead of simply flipping past the covers. The first advertisement you land on shows a woman in a string of pearls, cradling a jar of mayonnaise the way most people cradle a sleeping infant. Her expression is warm, her posture relaxed, her smile the particular width of someone who has been asked to hold that exact pose for several hours under hot studio lighting and has decided to simply endure it. Beneath her, in elegant script, the copy reads something to the effect of "A happy home begins with a creamy touch." You read it twice, mostly because you're trying to understand what precisely a jar of emulsified oil and egg has to do with domestic happiness, and you come up empty both times. The tone of these advertisements, you're beginning to notice, is remarkably consistent from page to page. They assume, without ever quite saying so, that you are three things at once, deeply devoted to the art of homemaking, in constant and urgent need of instruction, and permanently, unshakably cheerful, even while performing tasks that would test the patience of a saint. It's an odd kind of arithmetic. You are expected to already know how to run a household, and yet also to require a 2-page spread explaining, in painstaking detail, how to correctly slice a sandwich. You turn the page and find a cartoon housewife sprinkling pre-shredded cheese across a casserole with the ecstatic energy of someone who has just discovered fire. The caption beneath her reads simply, "Even you can manage this." You sit with that phrase for a moment. It isn't quite an insult, and it isn't quite encouragement either. It occupies some strange, deliberate middle ground, a phrase engineered to make you feel just slightly beneath the task, so that succeeding at it, even at something as small as shredding cheese, carries the faint, hollow satisfaction of having cleared a bar that was never set very high to begin with. Further in, a full-page spread announces the arrival of a new instant pudding mix, promising that preparing it for your family is nothing less than a demonstration of devotion. You find yourself wondering quietly, devotion to whom exactly? Your husband? Your children? The pudding itself gives no indication. It simply sits there in its illustrated bowl, glossy and smug, radiating a kind of moral authority that no dessert, in your opinion, has any business possessing. The advertisements don't stop at food. Turning further through the magazine, you find a full page devoted to a new vacuum cleaner, illustrated with a woman running it across her living room floor in heels, a strand of pearls, and a dress that looks entirely unsuited to actual housework. The copy underneath informs you that a cleaner home leads, somehow, directly to a more affectionate husband. You glance down at your own bare feet against the kitchen floor, at your own house dress with its faint flower stain along one hip, and decide privately that the woman in the illustration has clearly never actually vacuumed anything in her life. There's a particular kind of logic running underneath all of these advertisements, once you start to notice it. If you use the correct brand of soup, your casserole succeeds. If your casserole succeeds, your dinner succeeds. If your dinner succeeds, your household runs smoothly. And if your household runs smoothly, your marriage, by some unspoken but heavily implied extension, remains happy and secure. It's an enormous amount of responsibility to place on a single can of cream of mushroom soup. And yet, turning through page after page of these advertisements, you start to understand exactly how a person could come to believe it, one bright, cheerful headline at a time. You close the magazine eventually, setting it back down on the stack with the others, and take a slow breath. No woman, you think to yourself, has ever achieved genuine spiritual fulfillment from a can of condensed soup. But you also suspect that an entire industry has built itself, quite successfully, on convincing an entire generation of women to pretend otherwise, at least for the length of a dinner party. The pressure cooker is next, and it sits on the stovetop now, hissing with the low, ominous confidence of a machine that fully understands its own reputation. You approach it carefully, the way you might approach a large, unfamiliar dog. The manual, which you retrieved from a kitchen drawer earlier, insists in its opening pages that the device is completely safe when operated correctly, a sentence that, in your experience, tends to appear most prominently in the instructions for things that are not, in fact, entirely safe. The metal lid is locked into place with a kind of grim, mechanical determination, secured by a valve that trembles faintly, releasing thin curls of steam that rise toward the ceiling like small, urgent question marks. The advertisements for this particular device were breathless in their enthusiasm. Cut your cooking time in half, they promised. A revolution in the modern kitchen. What none of them mentioned, you're discovering firsthand, is the particular psychological toll of standing 3 feet away from a sealed metal vessel that periodically shrieks like it's personally offended by the concept of stew. You test the lid gently with the back of a wooden spoon, and the pot responds with a sharp, hostile hiss that sends you 2 full steps backward. Somewhere in the manual, buried in small print, is a stern warning never to attempt opening the lid before the pressure has released naturally. A phrase that strikes you as almost comically understated given the amount of barely contained force currently at work 6 inches from your hip. Your husband wanders through the kitchen at some point during all of this, glances briefly at the trembling, hissing device on the stove, remarks that it looks fine, and continues on to whatever business awaits him in the next room. He is not, you note, the one standing here negotiating with a small pressurized chamber of potential disaster. That particular assignment, like so many others today, belongs entirely to you. The whistle rises gradually from a low, throat-clearing hum to a full, piercing shriek that seems designed less to signal doneness and more to communicate some kind of existential distress. You grip your wooden spoon a little tighter, though you're not entirely sure what you'd actually do with it if the pot decided to escalate matters further. The manual offers no guidance on this point either. Eventually, mercifully, the shrieking begins to subside. The valve settles. The pot falls into a silence that feels less peaceful than suspenseful, the particular hush that arrives right before a decision is announced. You wait the recommended interval, watching the pressure indicator slowly lower itself, and only then do you attempt with great and deliberate care to release the remaining steam. A final burst escapes with a long, low sigh, as though the pot is reluctantly conceding the argument. When you finally lift the lid, the contents inside are, against every anxious expectation you'd built up over the last 20 minutes, genuinely excellent. The meat fork tender, the vegetables soft but not collapsed, the broth rich in a way that no can of condensed soup has ever quite managed to replicate. You hate, a little, that the machine was right. Tomorrow, you already know, you'll use it again anyway. With the stew finished and set aside, the second half of the morning belongs entirely to cleaning, a task the magazines describe with a kind of breathless, almost spiritual enthusiasm that you have never once, in your own experience, managed to locate anywhere inside an actual mop. You start with the vacuum, a heavy, roaring machine that seems to weigh nearly as much as a small child, but carries none of a child's charm. It drags across the carpet with a low mechanical growl, and you push it forward, listening to its tired hum, wondering how a device marketed as revolutionary manages to smell faintly of scorched rubber every time you use it for more than 10 consecutive minutes. The advertisements for this machine, like the advertisements for nearly everything else in this decade, promised a lighter load. What they failed to mention is that the load simply relocates rather than disappearing, the dust redistributed rather than eliminated, the effort shifted from one task to 3 smaller ones scattered across the rest of the afternoon. The mop comes next, standing in the corner where you left it, its wooden handle slightly bowed from years of faithful, thankless service. You dunk it into a bucket of soapy water, which clouds instantly to a dull, uncertain gray, as though the dirt itself has decided, quite suddenly, to abandon all pretense of staying hidden. You drag the mop across the kitchen floor and watch, with a familiar and weary resignation, as a streak appears in its wake, a streak that, as far as you can tell, did not exist on the floor before you started cleaning it. The magazines insist that housekeeping, properly approached, is not simply labor but something closer to meditation, a way of expressing devotion to your family through the careful, repetitive rhythm of a well-run household. You find this framing difficult to reconcile with the specific sensation currently radiating up your lower back, which feels considerably less like meditation and considerably more like the accumulated toll of several consecutive hours spent bending, lifting, and scrubbing. You move from room to room, dusting shelves that seem to generate new dust the moment you finish them, refolding a stack of linens that no one but you will ever notice, and gathering an overflowing laundry basket that appears to replenish itself overnight through some mechanism you have never fully understood. Given that the household contains only 4 people and none of them, as far as you know, changes clothes more than twice a day. The washing machine rumbles to life once you've loaded it, a newer model that promises, in its own set of glossy advertisements, to save you time and effort in equal measure. You measure the detergent with the particular caution of someone who has read at least one article warning that too much detergent signals wastefulness, while too little signals neglect. And you find, once again, that the correct amount seems to exist in some narrow, unmarked space between the two that no article has ever actually specified. By the time you circle back to the kitchen, the floor you mopped less than an hour ago has already collected a fine new layer of crumbs from lunch preparations, and you find yourself staring down at it with the particular, quiet defeat of someone watching a tide come back in. The floor, you're beginning to suspect, does not actually get clean in any permanent sense. It simply achieves a temporary, fragile state of cleanliness that lasts exactly as long as no one in the house does anything at all. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, a small window of quiet opens up, and you use it, as instructed by roughly a dozen different magazine articles, to prepare a snack, though the word prepare is doing a fair amount of heavy lifting here, given that what's actually involved is slicing a block of cheese that seems, structurally, closer to rubber than to dairy, and arranging it alongside a stack of crackers dense enough to double as roofing material. You place a slice of cheese in your mouth and are struck, as always, by its peculiar glossy uniformity, a color that exists nowhere in nature, a texture that seems to have been engineered specifically to survive long journeys and longer shelf lives. The crackers offer a similar experience, dense and unyielding in a way that tests your molars rather than rewards them, less an invitation to enjoy a snack and more a small, silent trial of endurance. The magazines, of course, have thoughts on snack presentation as well. One article you glanced at earlier suggested arranging olives on toothpicks in careful geometric patterns for guests, as though a mid-afternoon snack requires the same level of aesthetic planning as a formal dinner party. You look down at your own plate: cheese, crackers, a small scattering of salted nuts, and feel, for a brief moment, that you have failed some invisible standard set by a woman you will never meet. Still, you sit with your plate for a few stolen minutes, and something about the stillness of the kitchen at this hour, the light slanting low through the window, the hum of the refrigerator, the absence, for once, of anyone asking you for anything, feels less like indulgence and more like a small, quiet mercy. It isn't much. 5 minutes, maybe 10. But in a decade that seems determined to fill every single one of your hours with some form of labor, 5 uninterrupted minutes with a plate of rubbery cheese starts to feel, against all reasonable odds, like a genuine kind of victory. By 4:30, the light through the kitchen window has shifted to that particular gold color that seems to exist only in the hour before a husband comes home, and you find yourself standing over the counter once again, staring down at a piece of raw chicken as though it might, through sheer force of will, cook itself out of pity for you. This is the hour every magazine article seems to have been quietly preparing you for all day, the sacred, slightly frantic ritual of turning a handful of ordinary ingredients into something that can be called, with a straight face, dinner. You reach for the pantry, and your hand finds, almost without needing to look, the can. The same can that has appeared in some form or another at nearly every meal today. Cream of something. Chicken, mushroom, celery, the label changes, but the underlying purpose never does. No dinner in this decade, you're beginning to understand, is considered complete without a can of condensed soup acting as its structural adhesive. You peel back the lid and the contents slide out in a single dense cylinder, holding its shape with the same stubborn confidence it showed this morning, landing in the mixing bowl with a soft, unceremonious thud. You whisk in a splash of milk, thinning it just slightly, though the resulting mixture remains closer in texture to wallpaper paste than to anything you'd confidently describe as a sauce. The label promises a rich, creamy result. What you're looking at seems to have been produced somewhere considerably less glamorous than the label suggests. The protein goes in next, chicken today, though the recipe itself seems entirely indifferent to the specifics, nodding cheerfully that tuna, beef, or whatever's on hand will serve equally well. You add a handful of frozen peas, their thaw uncertain, and stir the whole mixture together with the particular, weary determination of someone who has stopped expecting the process to feel like cooking and started simply thinking of it as assembly. The topping, as always, calls for something crushed and crisp, and today, like most days, that means reaching once more for the cereal box. You pour a portion into a paper bag and press it flat with a rolling pin, the crunch of flakes breaking apart beneath your palms strangely, unexpectedly satisfying. The one part of this entire process, you realize, that actually feels like release rather than obligation. You scatter the crumbs across the top of the dish like a light, sad confetti and slide the whole thing into the oven. While it bakes, you flip once more through a magazine left open on the table and land on an article promising no-fail dinner solutions. Every single recipe within it built around some variation of condensed soup. One recipe, more ambitious than the rest, suggests pouring condensed tomato soup directly over a meatloaf and calls the resulting dish zesty. You read the word twice, unconvinced, and privately conclude that whoever wrote it has led a life largely untroubled by any real understanding of zest. The phone rings just as you're wiping down the counter, and you already know, before you even lift the receiver, exactly who it will be. It's Carol from 2 houses down, whose voice arrives through the line already mid-smile, as though she has never once in her life answered a phone without being pleased about something. "What are you making tonight?" She asks in the particular tone of someone who already suspects the answer will disappoint her and is looking forward to confirming it. You glance over at the oven, where a chicken and pea casserole is currently baking under a crust of crushed cereal, and something in you, some old, familiar instinct, takes over before you fully decided to let it. "Roast chicken," you hear yourself say, "with an herb dressing." There is no herb dressing. There has never been an herb dressing. Your spice cabinet contains salt, a slightly more expensive version of salt, and a jar of paprika you bought 2 years ago because you liked the color of the tin. And yet the lie arrives smoothly, almost gracefully, the way lies tend to arrive when an entire culture has spent years quietly teaching you that the truth, a casserole built from a can and a box of cereal, simply isn't good enough to say out loud. Carol, for her part, is only too happy to describe her own dinner in loving, unhurried detail. A roast with vegetables from her garden, she explains, as though gardens exist purely to make other women feel inadequate by comparison. You murmur the appropriate responses at the appropriate intervals, half listening, half calculating how much longer the casserole has left in the oven, and mostly wondering, in some quiet corner of your mind, whether Carol's garden vegetables are really as effortless as she makes them sound, or whether she, too, is somewhere on the other end of this call, quietly performing a version of her day that bears only a loose resemblance to the truth. This, you're coming to understand, is the real function of the daily afternoon telephone call. Not information, not friendship exactly, but a kind of ongoing, informal audit. A chance for the entire neighborhood to quietly measure itself against itself, one cheerful, slightly exaggerated phone call at a time. Before she hangs up, Carol invites you over for coffee later in the week, and you both know, without either of you saying so, that coffee really means something closer to inspection, a chance for her to see firsthand whether your kitchen matches the version of it you described on the phone. Of course, you say, because refusing isn't really an option in a neighborhood where everyone seems to know, with uncomfortable precision, exactly how many good towels everyone else owns. When you finally set the receiver back down, the kitchen feels a little smaller than it did before the call. The invented roast chicken with herb dressing hanging somewhere in the air above the very real casserole slowly finishing in the oven. You glance toward the stove, toward the truth of your evening, and begin, quietly, to prepare it as though it were the ambitious meal you just described to your neighbor. Dessert tonight comes from a box, and this fact alone seems to require more internal negotiation than it probably should. You stand at the counter holding a bright, cheerful package that promises a perfect cake with almost no effort at all. After the day you've had the vacuum, the mop, the pressure cooker, the fabricated roast chicken, the idea of a dessert that essentially prepares itself feels, for a moment, like something close to salvation. You read the instructions. Add water. That's nearly the entire process. A cake summoned from little more than powder and a bit of stirring. But then you notice, printed a little further down the box, an additional instruction: crack 1 egg. And you find yourself pausing over it, because you happen to remember reading in some article or another that this particular step was added deliberately, not because the cake genuinely required it, but because early versions of instant cake mix, needing nothing but water, made women feel as though they hadn't actually done anything at all. The egg, it turns out, isn't really an ingredient. It's a small, manufactured gesture of involvement, engineered specifically so that you can feel, if only slightly, that you personally contributed something to the dessert your family is about to eat. You crack the egg anyway. Because the alternative, a cake requiring no visible labor whatsoever, apparently carries its own quiet shame in this particular decade. The batter comes together smooth and pale and strangely perfect, and something about that perfection nags at you as you pour it into the pan. It feels almost like cheating, as though you've bypassed some unspoken contract with the generations of women before you who beat butter and sugar by hand for 20 minutes at a stretch, and would never have dreamed of measuring a cake's success by how little effort it demanded. While it bakes, the kitchen fills with the warm, familiar scent of vanilla, and you find yourself tidying up around the edges of the room, refolding a dish towel, wiping a counter that's already clean, filling the waiting time with small, unnecessary tasks, because some part of you feels that if the cake itself required so little labor, the least you can do is manufacture a bit more elsewhere. When it finally emerges from the oven, golden and evenly risen in a way that no cake you've made entirely from scratch has ever quite managed, you frost it from a can, and the whole thing tastes, when you finally sit down to it with your family that evening, genuinely wonderful, soft, sweet, and better than the effort involved would seem to justify. Your husband has a second slice without comment. The children ask for thirds. No one at the table seems even remotely aware of the quiet moral negotiation that took place over a single cracked egg an hour earlier. And by the time the plates are empty, you've mostly decided that maybe that's fine. Maybe a cake doesn't need to cost you anything more than this to be worth making. Later, standing at the sink with dishwater cooling around your wrists, you find yourself thinking about the apron still tied around your waist. The one that appeared there this morning before you'd even fully opened your eyes. The one you've worn, without much conscious thought, through nearly every task of the day. It's a small, unremarkable garment, cotton, faintly patterned, worn thin at the ties from years of use. And yet it has, by the end of a day like this one, absorbed a small history of its own. A splash of tomato sauce near the hem, a dusting of flour along one pocket, a faint burn mark near the waist from an incident with the pressure cooker you'd rather not think too hard about. Nobody will ever read these marks the way a historian reads a document, and yet, in their own small way, they tell the exact same story, proof, worn directly into the fabric, of everything this day actually required of you, whether or not anyone else in the house ever noticed. The magazines, of course, prefer a different version of the apron entirely, something decorative, delicate, worn by a smiling woman in a kitchen that never seems to require any actual work. Your apron knows better. It has spent the day exactly where you have, absorbing exactly what you've absorbed, and by the time you finally untie it that evening, it comes off heavy in a way that has nothing to do with its actual weight. You hang it back on its hook by the pantry, and it hangs there a little limp, a little tired, waiting for tomorrow, when the whole quiet performance will begin again. With the dinner dishes cleared and a small, precious stretch of evening opening up before you, you sink into a chair at the kitchen table and pull the stack of magazines toward you once more, not out of any real enthusiasm, but out of the particular, low-level curiosity of someone poking at a bruise to see if it still hurts. The covers, as always, feature the same interchangeable woman in her many interchangeable outfits, smiling with the fixed, luminous confidence of someone who has never once burned a casserole or argued with a pressure cooker. You open the first one and are greeted almost immediately by a 2-page spread with the headline, "Bring Sunshine into Your Home," which turns out, on closer reading, to be less about literal sunlight and more about the author's conviction that a woman's personal attitude single-handedly determines the emotional temperature of an entire household. Not the family's finances, not anyone's health, not the state of the world outside, simply your attitude, apparently capable of independently generating either domestic harmony or domestic ruin. You read on, partly out of morbid curiosity, and find a recipe a few pages later for something called surprise beef delight. The surprise being, as far as you can tell from the ingredient list, an unusually high tolerance for canned mushrooms. Beyond the recipes, the magazine widens its scope considerably, offering guidance on subjects that have nothing at all to do with cooking. There's a section on how to speak to your husband about his day, softly, briefly, and the article specifies never before he's had his after-work drink. There's another on disciplining children, which recommends firmness delivered always with a smile, as though the smile itself functions as some kind of behavioral sedative. And there's a beauty column promising that 5 simple steps can make you more feminine, steps that include thinking cheerful thoughts and wearing more pink, as though your entire personality were a wardrobe choice waiting to be corrected. You flip further and land on a small quiz, printed in a cheerful yellow box, titled "Are You a Good Wife?" You take it more or less on impulse, answering each question as honestly as you can. One asks whether you greet your husband at the door each evening with his slippers already in hand. You pause on this one, not because the answer is complicated, but because you genuinely have no idea at this exact moment where his slippers even are. The quiz offers no partial credit for honest confusion. According to its rigid little scoring key, you have apparently failed to qualify as a good wife on the strength of a single missing pair of slippers. Further into the magazine, a household advice columnist named something like Eleanor or Delphine. The names in these columns always seem to belong to women who have never personally scrubbed a burnt pan. Offers detailed instructions on folding cloth napkins into the shape of a swan for formal dinner parties. You think briefly of your own last dinner gathering, which ended not with elegant swan-shaped napkins, but with one of the children being quietly ill into a potted plant in the hallway, and you decide that this particular columnist in your household appear to be operating in entirely different realities. There is, tucked toward the back, a section on marriage maintenance, and it's here that the tone shifts from merely aspirational to something closer to a warning. Marital dissatisfaction, the article explains, often stems from a wife's failure to make dinner appear effortless. You read the sentence again, slower this time. Effortless. As though the entire day you've just lived through, the pressure cooker, the mop, the borrowed vacuum, the invented roast chicken you described over the phone, was somehow meant to have happened invisibly, off to the side, so that your husband could simply sit down each evening to a meal that materialized, apparently, out of nothing more than affection. By the time you close the last magazine, you feel as though you've been gently, cheerfully scolded by roughly a dozen women you will never meet. Too tired, according to one article, not attentive enough according to another, insufficiently feminine according to a third. It's an impressive amount of judgment to extract from a stack of glossy paper, and you sit for a moment simply breathing, letting your eyes travel around your own real, lived-in kitchen, dishes drying by the sink, a crayon drawing taped crookedly to the icebox, your apron hanging tired on its hook, and you decide, quietly, that you don't especially need a magazine's permission to consider the day a success. 2 nights later, after a small kitchen mishap that leaves the edges of a stew slightly more scorched than intended, you find yourself standing in front of the freezer holding a box you've kept tucked behind the peas for exactly this kind of occasion. It's a frozen dinner, a single foil tray divided into neat compartments, each one holding a different component of a full meal, ready in under half an hour with almost no preparation at all. You'd purchased it weeks earlier on something close to impulse, the way you might buy an umbrella on a clear day, simply in case. Tonight feels unmistakably like the day it was intended for. You slide the tray into the oven and stand back, feeling something you can only describe as faintly rebellious. No chopping, no condensed soup, no hour spent hovering anxiously beside a hissing pressure cooker, just a tray of frozen food and 25 uninterrupted minutes that belong, for once, entirely to you. When the timer finally sounds and you pull the tray free, the reality inside bears only a loose resemblance to the glossy photograph on the box. The mashed potatoes have the slightly lumpy texture of something assembled in a hurry. The peas sit in a small, defeated cluster in one corner of the tray. The Salisbury steak steams faintly in a manner that feels, somehow, almost apologetic. None of it looks like much. And yet, taking your first bite standing right there at the counter, you find that none of that particularly matters. What you're actually tasting, underneath the slightly bland gravy and the faintly metallic tang of the foil tray, is something closer to relief. Your husband wanders in partway through dinner, glances at the table and asks, mildly curious, what happened to the stew you'd mentioned earlier. Burnt, you say simply, with the same calm, unbothered tone you might use to comment on the weather. These things happen. He accepts this without further question, entirely unaware that the scorched stew, quietly discarded, was less an accident and more a small, deliberate act of household mutiny. The children don't ask any follow-up questions either. They're too busy investigating the small dessert compartment tucked into the corner of the tray, a brownie that manages the peculiar feat of being simultaneously slightly underbaked and slightly overbaked in different corners of the same square. You watch them eat it with genuine enthusiasm, and something in you settles, just slightly, at the sight. Later, once the kitchen has quieted and the tray has been tucked deep into the trash where no passing magazine or neighbor could ever discover it, you allow yourself a small, private moment of satisfaction. Convenience, you're beginning to understand, was never really given to you by the advertisements as freely as they claimed. Most days, it arrived with strings attached, extra steps, extra guilt, extra performance layered on top of whatever time it supposedly saved. But every so often, on a night like tonight, you manage to take it on your own terms instead, quietly, without asking anyone's permission. And that particular kind of ease, stolen rather than granted, tastes better than anything a glossy magazine spread has ever promised you. Dinner itself, on most ordinary nights, unfolds less like a meal and more like a small, carefully staged production. And tonight's stew, replaced by frozen tray notwithstanding, is no exception. You set the table with a kind of quiet, practiced choreography. Cloth napkins, folded if not into swans then at least into neat, respectable rectangles. Silverware angled the way one particularly insistent magazine article once instructed, at a precise diagonal that apparently signals both hospitality and restraint. A small vase of flowers from the yard, only slightly wilted, positioned at the center of the table like a modest stage prop. Your husband arrives, tie loosened, expression settling into the particular blankness of a man who has spent the day thinking about something entirely unrelated to dinner. The children file in after him, momentarily quieted by the hush that seems to fall automatically over the table the instant the meal is served. The same instinctive silence, you suspect, that settles over households in nearly every kitchen up and down this street at almost exactly this same hour. You take your own seat last, because every article you've ever read on the subject insists this is simply what a considerate hostess does, even on evenings when every muscle in your body would prefer to simply collapse into the nearest chair the moment dinner is ready. You serve the meal in careful order, main dish first, then the vegetables, boiled slightly past their prime, then the rolls, soft in appearance but faintly dense in practice. Each item presented as though it were the result of hours of careful preparation rather than, on some nights, a foil tray pulled from the freezer. Conversation, when it comes, arrives slowly and in small pieces. Your husband mentions something from his day at the office, delivered with the mild detachment of a man reading a weather report. The children, once their initial hunger has been satisfied, begin to talk over each other about something that happened at school, their voices rising in the particular overlapping excitement that belongs only to children who have finally been given permission to speak freely after a long day of being told to be quiet. For a few minutes, something in the room genuinely does soften. A compliment about the rolls, a small joke that actually lands. The particular, fragile warmth of a family gathered together at the end of a long day, momentarily unaware of or unconcerned with all the invisible labor that made this exact moment possible. And it's in this small window, more than in any magazine article or advertisement, that you begin to understand what the whole elaborate performance of dinner is actually for. Not for Carol down the street, not for the glossy pages stacked on your counter. For this. For a few unremarkable, ordinary minutes at a table together, before the plates are cleared and the whole quiet ritual begins preparing itself. Once again, for tomorrow. The following Saturday brings with it the church potluck, an event that arrives every few weeks on the calendar with the deceptive gentleness of a simple community gathering, and which you have, by now, come to understand as something considerably closer to a quiet, unspoken competition. You carry your casserole down the church basement stairs with both hands, careful not to tilt it, careful not to let the crushed cracker topping slide too far to one side. The basement itself smells of folding tables, floor wax, and the particular mingled aroma of several dozen competing dishes, each one determined to announce itself the moment the door swings open. Long tables stretch the length of the room, draped in white paper cloths, already crowded with an almost overwhelming variety of offerings. Towering gelatin creations, glistening meatloaves, deviled eggs arranged in careful, symmetrical rows, and somewhere near the center, a dish involving canned tuna and pineapple that you decide on sight not to investigate any further. You find a spot for your casserole roughly in the middle of the table, positioned with the same careful calibration you might apply to a diplomatic negotiation. Not too far toward the front, which might read as overconfident. Not too far toward the back, which might suggest you'd given up before you'd even started. The middle, you've learned, communicates exactly the right tone, a woman who tried, without appearing to have tried too hard. The other women drift near the table in loose clusters, chatting in a tone that sounds, on the surface, like simple friendly conversation, but which you've come to recognize as something closer to careful mutual evaluation. "Is that your casserole?" someone asks, in a voice pitched with just enough sweetness to make the question feel less like curiosity and more like a gentle, pointed observation. You smile in return, the particular smile you've developed specifically for these occasions, the one that says, politely but unmistakably, that you will absolutely remember this exchange. A woman near the head of the table, you recognize her as one of the more established figures in this particular social hierarchy, presents her own gelatin creation with the quiet confidence of someone unveiling a trophy. It towers impressively, suspended fruit visible within its glowing depths, clearly the product of considerable time and no small amount of practiced skill. "It took hours," she informs the small crowd gathered nearby, and you believe her without much difficulty. Some women, you've come to understand, Treat gelatin molding the way others might treat a serious hobby, with genuine patience and genuine pride. And there's something almost admirable in that, even as you privately have no intention of ever attempting anything quite so elaborate yourself. Near the far end of the table stands the unofficial matriarch of this particular gathering, a woman whose approval or disapproval of any given dish seems to carry an outsized influence over how the rest of the room regards it. You watch, almost involuntarily, as she moves slowly down the table, sampling a small taste from each offering, her expression giving away almost nothing. When she finally reaches your casserole, time seems to slow just slightly. She takes a modest forkful, considers it for a moment longer than strictly necessary, and gives a small, single nod. It isn't effusive. It isn't a ribbon or a prize, but it's real, and you feel it land somewhere just beneath your ribs with more warmth than you'd expected. Children weave between the tables throughout the meal, narrowly avoiding several near-catastrophic collisions with dishes that took considerable effort to prepare, and the room fills gradually with the low, comfortable hum of a community doing what communities like this one do best: gathering, eating, comparing notes, quietly measuring themselves against one another, and somewhere beneath all of that measuring, genuinely enjoying each other's company. By the time you gather your half-empty casserole dish to head home, the basement is beginning to empty out, chairs scraping back, conversations winding down into their final, unhurried stretches. You climb the stairs back up into the evening air feeling, against all the low-grade anxiety that preceded the event, something surprisingly close to satisfaction. You survived the table. You earned the nod. And whatever quiet, unspoken scoring system governs these gatherings, you suspect you came out of it just fine. A different kind of gathering awaits you a few days later, when a knock at the door reveals your neighbor standing on the porch with an invitation to what she describes, with genuine enthusiasm, as a Tupperware party. You arrive that evening to find her living room rearranged to accommodate a small semicircle of folding chairs, each one occupied by a neighborhood woman balancing a tiny cup of fruit punch on her knee. At the front of the room stands the hostess for the occasion, not your neighbor, but a woman brought in specifically to conduct the demonstration, her hair arranged with the kind of architectural precision that suggests it could survive a moderate windstorm without moving. "Ladies," she announces, holding aloft a small pastel container with the reverence of someone presenting a religious artifact, "freshness is power." A soft murmur of agreement moves through the room, and you find yourself nodding along despite having no immediate opinion on the subject, carried along by the same quiet social current that seems to be moving everyone else in the circle. She demonstrates the container's signature feature, a small, deliberate press of the lid that releases a soft puff of air with an audible little sound, which she refers to, with total seriousness, as burping the container. The room responds with genuine, if slightly bewildered, applause. You clap along as well, mostly because refusing to would feel, in this particular setting, disproportionately confrontational. The presentation continues through a rotation of pastel-colored containers in various shapes and sizes, each one promising to solve some specific and previously unspoken household crisis. Stale crackers, wilting produce. The faint, lingering odor that seems to accumulate in refrigerators no matter how carefully they're maintained. The hostess moves through the room asking each woman, one by one, to name her own particular storage struggle, and there's something almost confessional about the way each answer arrives, quiet, a little embarrassed, met each time with a solemn, understanding nod from the hostess, as though she alone holds the solution to whatever small domestic shame has just been shared aloud. When your turn comes, you offer something modest about bread going stale faster than you'd like, and the hostess responds by placing a pale blue container directly into your hands, informing you with total conviction that no household should ever have to suffer such a fate. You turn the container over once, testing its weight, its smooth plastic surface catching the lamplight. It feels somehow both entirely unnecessary and strangely hopeful all at once. By the end of the evening, An order sheet has made its way around the circle, and you find yourself signing your name beside 2 or 3 items, the total arriving at a sum slightly larger than you'd intended to spend. But glancing around the room, you notice you're hardly alone. Every woman present appears to be signing for at least something, each of you quietly absorbing a small financial sting in exchange for the promise of a slightly more organized refrigerator. And something in that shared, communal expense makes the whole evening feel less like a sales pitch and more like a strange, small ritual of neighborhood solidarity. Walking home afterward under the porch lights lining the street, receipt folded into your purse, you find yourself smiling despite the whole absurdity of it. Yes, you've just spent a fair portion of the week's grocery budget on plastic containers shaped, more or less, like optimistic marshmallows. But there was something oddly comforting in the shared experience of it all, a room full of women, briefly united by nothing more complicated than the modest, hopeful fantasy of a slightly more orderly kitchen. By the time the house finally settles into silence that night, children asleep, husband dozing in front of a droning radio program about highway construction, you find yourself drawn back into the kitchen, guided mostly by moonlight and the low hum of the refrigerator. You're not entirely sure what you're looking for until you find it, a half-used bowl of leftover cake batter, tucked toward the back of the refrigerator, chilled now into something thick and velvety. You retrieve a spoon, glance briefly toward the hallway to make sure the house remains asleep, and take a small, private taste directly from the bowl. It's sweet and simple and entirely unremarkable in every practical sense, and yet something about eating it standing alone in a dark, quiet kitchen at this hour feels, unmistakably, like a small act of rebellion. No magazine has ever instructed you on the correct way to eat batter from a bowl at midnight. No advertisement has ever suggested that this particular moment might be worth having. It exists entirely outside the day's careful choreography of expectation, belonging to no one but you. You lean against the counter, letting your shoulders drop for what feels like the first time all day, and let your mind drift back over everything the day actually required of you. The casserole, the pressure cooker, the invented roast chicken over the phone, the magazine quiz that judged you for a missing pair of slippers. The small triumphant nod from the woman at the potluck table. It's an enormous amount to carry inside a single day, and yet somehow, standing here now, spoon in hand, none of it feels quite as heavy as it did at the time. You think briefly about the gelatin molds lurking somewhere in half the refrigerators up and down this street, glowing faintly green in the dark, waiting for tomorrow's inevitable comparisons to begin all over again. And you think, too, about all the other women on this street who might, at this very same hour, be standing in their own dark kitchens, spoon in hand, quietly enjoying some small stolen pleasure the magazines never thought to mention. You hope, somewhere in the quiet of your own mind, that they are. You suspect, in fact, that they probably are. You take one more small taste of the batter before setting the bowl back into the refrigerator, rinsing the spoon, and switching off the light. As you make your way back down the hallway toward bed, the kitchen falls dark and still behind you, waiting, patient and undemanding, for tomorrow's performance to begin once more. There's a particular sound the kitchen timer makes in this house, a thin mechanical tick that seems to grow slightly louder every time you find yourself standing near the stove, waiting on something you can't quite see through the oven's small glass window. Tonight, the casserole inside has been baking for exactly the number of minutes the recipe specified, and yet you find yourself hovering nearby anyway, the way you seem to hover every single night at this exact hour, unable to fully trust the small metal dial to do its job without your direct supervision. The magazines are, as usual, no help in easing this particular anxiety. One article you read earlier this week insisted that timing is the single most important skill a modern homemaker can develop, framing a few minutes of variance in baking time with the gravity of a matter of national importance. You would love, quite genuinely, to invite whoever wrote that article into your kitchen for a single evening and watch them attempt to manage a casserole, two arguing children, and a phone that might ring at any moment, all while maintaining perfect timing on a dial that seems to have a mind and a temperament entirely of its own. You crouch slightly to peer through the oven door, watching the crushed topping bubble and darken at what you hope is the correct rate. The dial itself sits stiff and slightly uncooperative when you attempt to adjust it, twisting further than intended and landing on some arbitrary number that could mean 6 minutes remaining or 60, depending entirely on the timer's mood tonight. You've long since stopped fully trusting it, and yet you continue relying on it anyway, mostly because the alternative, standing here with no guidance at all, feels somehow even less reliable. When the bell finally rings, sharp and insistent, you pull the dish free and set it on top of the stove, examining the crust with the practiced, uncertain squint of someone who has burned enough dinners to know that appearances can be deeply misleading. It looks, you decide after a moment, probably fine. Not perfect. Not disastrous. Simply adequately fine, which after everything else today has demanded of you, feels like a perfectly acceptable outcome. Your husband passes through the kitchen a few minutes later, catches the smell drifting from the stove, and offers a brief, appreciative comment before continuing on toward the living room, entirely unaware of the small, private negotiation that timer and oven have just concluded on his behalf. You allow yourself a short, tired exhale, the kind that carries with it not quite triumph, but something close enough to it that you're willing to accept the substitution for tonight. The following evening brings with it a familiar and slightly less welcome ritual, the reappearance once again of the meatloaf. You're fairly certain, standing in front of the open refrigerator, that your family finished off the vast majority of it 2 nights ago. And yet here it sits, wrapped in wax paper, seemingly undiminished, as though some quiet overnight process has been steadily replenishing it while nobody was watching. Beside it sits the remains of the gelatin mold from the potluck, its once cheerful wobble now reduced to a slow, faintly unsettling shimmy. And behind that, tucked under a sheet of foil, the last portion of last week's casserole, still holding together with the stubborn, unnatural persistence that only a can of condensed soup seems capable of providing. The magazines are firm on this particular subject. Wasting food, several articles have made clear, is considered not simply careless but almost a small moral failing, a quiet betrayal of thrift and good sense that no self-respecting homemaker would allow to happen under her own roof. And so, rather than discard any of it, you set about the evening's real task, transforming yesterday's dinner into tonight's, disguised carefully enough that no one at the table will feel entitled to complain. The meatloaf becomes something you privately think of as meatloaf hash, chopped and mixed with a handful of leftover noodles. The casserole gets a fresh scattering of peas stirred through it, less an addition than a kind of camouflage. The gelatin mold, somewhat more ambitiously, becomes tonight's dessert, presented with a straight face as though it were an entirely new creation, rather than a slightly less structurally sound version of what it was 3 days ago. Your husband wanders through the kitchen partway through your preparations, sniffs the air and remarks, with a note of mild suspicion, that dinner smells familiar tonight. You offer no confirmation and no denial, simply continuing your work with the particular practiced composure of someone who has done this exact dance many times before. When the family finally sits down to eat, one of the children pauses mid-bite, studies the plate with obvious skepticism, and asks whether this is a new recipe. Yes, you say, with total, unwavering conviction, because at this stage in the evening, conviction is really the only tool left at your disposal. They eat it anyway, mostly without complaint, and you find yourself thinking, as you clear the plates afterward, that leftovers in this decade function less like ordinary food, and more like a small, ongoing test of ingenuity, proof, delivered fresh each week. That a resourceful homemaker can stretch almost anything into one more meal, provided she's willing to disguise it well enough that nobody asks too many follow-up questions. Later, setting the newly repurposed remnants back into the refrigerator for what you sincerely hope will be the final time, you notice, with a faint and weary resignation, that there somehow seems to be slightly more of everything than there was before you started. The meatloaf appears to have expanded rather than diminished. The casserole dish looks fuller than when you pulled it out. You close the refrigerator door slowly, murmuring something under your breath that isn't quite a prayer and isn't quite a threat, and decide, quietly, that tomorrow's battle can simply wait until tomorrow. That night, sleep arrives slowly, and when it finally does, it brings with it a strange, persistent soundtrack that seems to follow you directly out of your waking hours and straight into your dreams. You find yourself, somewhere in that soft, uncertain space between consciousness and true sleep, standing inside a spotless, impossibly bright kitchen that resembles no kitchen you've ever actually cooked in. A cheerful jingle plays from some unseen radio, looping the same handful of lines about condensed soup, with the relentless, chipper enthusiasm of a choir that has clearly never once had to clean a burnt saucepan. A man in a crisp suit gestures toward a gleaming pyramid of soup can stacked nearly to the ceiling, informing you, with total sincerity, that your entire life could be transformed if only you truly believed in the power of cream of mushroom. The dream shifts, the way dreams do, without warning or explanation, and suddenly you're moving through an endless suburban hallway lined with identical kitchens, each one occupied by a different smiling woman offering you a taste of something simmering on her stove. One insists her chicken, à la king, is simply the same recipe, only wetter. Another presents a casserole so enormous it blocks the light from an entire window, whispering, with theatrical pride, that it required no fewer than 5 separate cans to assemble. You try to walk past them, but your legs move slowly, the way legs always seem to in dreams, carrying you nowhere in particular no matter how urgently you try to escape. You wake with a small start, heart beating slightly faster than it should, the last echo of the jingle still looping faintly somewhere in the back of your mind. Beside you, your husband continues sleeping soundly, his breathing settling into a rhythm that sounds, disturbingly, almost identical to the jingle's own cheerful cadence. You lie there for a moment in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and realize with a tired, private amusement that there appears to be no escaping these advertisements. Not in the grocery store, not on the radio, not even, apparently, inside the supposedly private sanctuary of your own unconscious mind. The next morning, switching on the kitchen radio out of habit, you're greeted almost immediately by another cheerful jingle, this one promoting a different soup entirely, but carrying the exact same relentless enthusiasm as the one from your dream. You switch the dial, and a different voice, singing a nearly identical melody about a nearly identical product, fills the room in its place. There seems to be no true escape from any of it, waking or otherwise, and after a moment you find yourself laughing quietly to yourself at the sheer, absurd persistence of the whole enterprise. Even your own subconscious, it turns out, has apparently been sponsored. There's a particular phrase that keeps appearing across nearly every advertisement you've encountered this week, printed in bright, confident lettering across soup labels, cake mix boxes, and vacuum cleaner catalogs alike. The promise of free time, time for hobbies, time for rest, time, the advertisement suggests, to finally sit down with a novel or a cup of tea or simply your own thoughts, all made possible by whichever product happens to be selling itself to you that particular week. You find yourself standing at the kitchen counter one afternoon, glancing at the clock, trying honestly to account for where exactly all this promised free time has been hiding. According to the soup companies, you should have gained back entire minutes, maybe even hours, over the course of the week. According to the cereal companies, breakfast alone should have freed up a small fortune in previously wasted time. According to the instant coffee jar still sitting on your counter, even your morning cup was supposed to have handed you back some meaningful portion of your day. And yet, glancing around your kitchen at this exact moment, you can find no obvious evidence of any of it. The laundry basket, despite the newer, more efficient washing machine, still seems to refill itself faster than you can empty it. The floor, despite the newer, more powerful vacuum, still collects a fresh layer of crumbs within an hour of being cleaned. The frozen chicken on the counter, despite the pressure cooker's promised efficiency, still requires your full and undivided attention for the better part of an hour before it becomes anything resembling dinner. You try, for a moment, to imagine what you might actually do with a genuine, uninterrupted stretch of free time, if it ever did arrive. Read something that isn't a magazine article instructing you how to behave. Sit outside without also folding laundry. Simply exist quietly without the low, constant hum of some task waiting just behind you. The idea feels almost foreign, like trying to picture a country you've only ever heard about secondhand. The truth, you're slowly beginning to understand, is a good deal less generous than any of the advertisements ever admitted. Convenience, as it's been sold to you all week, was never really designed to hand you back your time. It was designed, instead, to raise the bar on everything else: fancier meals expected in less time, cleaner floors expected with less effort, a more cheerful household expected regardless of how much labor actually went into maintaining it. Every shortcut seemed to arrive quietly bundled with a slightly higher standard attached, so that no matter how much easier any single task became, the overall list of things expected of you somehow never actually got any shorter. You lean against the counter for a moment, letting this small, quiet realization settle. Free time, as it turns out, was never really being given to you at all. It was simply a phrase, printed cheerfully across 100 different labels, describing a promise that never quite arrived, no matter how many soup cans you dutifully purchased in pursuit of it. That night, once the house has finally gone quiet, dishes done, children asleep, husband settled into his usual armchair doze in front of the television, you find yourself sitting alone at the kitchen table for a few final minutes before heading to bed, letting your eyes travel slowly around the room. It isn't a perfect kitchen, not by the standards laid out so confidently in any of the magazines stacked at the far end of the table. There's a faint scorch mark on the counter near the stove, evidence of last week's small pressure cooker incident. A crayon drawing, slightly crooked, is still taped to the icebox door. The floor, mopped diligently that very morning, already carries the faint outline of the day's foot traffic. None of it would photograph particularly well for a glossy advertisement. All of it somehow still feels entirely, unmistakably like a home. You think back over everything the day required of you: the casserole, the phone call with Carol, the magazine quiz that judged you over a missing pair of slippers, the frozen dinner eaten in quiet private triumph, the small stolen taste of cake batter at midnight. None of it was glamorous. Very little of it would have made for an impressive photograph in any of the magazines currently sitting closed on your counter. And yet, taken together, it amounted to something that kept an entire household fed, clothed, and functioning for one more day, largely due to labor that none of those magazines ever seemed particularly interested in actually showing. You wonder, quietly, whether other women up and down this street are sitting in their own kitchens at this exact hour, having their own version of this same thought. Whether Carol, behind her confident description of roast vegetables from her own garden, ever secretly relies on a can of soup she'd rather not mention out loud. Whether the woman with the towering, perfectly molded gelatin salad ever privately wonders if all that effort is really worth it. You suspect, somewhere deep down, that the answer to most of these questions is yes. That this entire performance, repeated quietly in kitchen after kitchen across the neighborhood, is being carried out by women who are, every single one of them, doing their absolute best under a set of expectations that were never entirely fair to begin with. History, you're coming to understand, doesn't only live in the large, dramatic moments. The declarations, the battles, the speeches remembered decades later. It also lives quietly in evenings exactly like this one, in casseroles held together by canned soup and stubborn improvisation, in women trading small, gentle exaggerations over the telephone rather than admitting a house sometimes runs on frozen dinners and a bit of luck, In magazines that promised joy through perfectly folded napkins, and in the women who read them anyway, laughed quietly to themselves, and went on living their lives regardless. You rise from the table eventually, turning off the kitchen light behind you, and the room settles into darkness, the refrigerator humming softly to itself, the oven timer resting silent on the stove, tomorrow's tasks waiting patiently, undemanding for the morning to begin all over again. Because that, in the end, is really the story of this particular decade's kitchens. Not perfection, not the effortless, luminous ease promised on every glossy cover. Just ordinary women showing up again and again, meal after meal, casserole after casserole, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of holding a household together. One can of condensed soup at a time. Sleep well tonight. You've more than earned it.